weekly podcast where we try to talk about something that's happening in the world today in this moment of crisis and to put it into a larger historical and theoretical context. This week, I'm very excited to have my fellow associate editor from Liberal Currents, Paul Crider, here with me, along with Matt McManus, author of The Political Theory of Liberal Socialism, among other things. Professor at, where do you teach again, Matt?
I'm a lecturer in political science at the University of Michigan.
Okay, a lecturer in political science at the University of Michigan, to talk about his book, The Political Theory of Liberal Socialism. And I guess I want to start by talking about socialism and why we're talking about it. You know, for most of my life, socialist has been kind of a dirty word. Republicans have been forever accusing Democrats of being communists, and Democrats have been forever pretty afraid of the accusation. And in 2016, suddenly everything changes. Bernie Sanders runs in the Democratic presidential primary, and he's not a Democrat, although he caucuses with the Democrats. He's an independent. He calls himself a socialist. He's an explicit, I believe in socialism kind of guy. And he goes to 40% in the Democratic primary, which is an enormously strong showing for somebody with those kinds of political credentials. The Democratic Socialists of America takes off. Their membership, they've been around for a long time, they've been around since the 60s, but their membership takes off enormously under the first Trump administration. They win various elected offices. The most famous politician associated with them is Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who is now rumored to be running for, or maybe mulling, we'll see, Senator Schumer's seat, who's been the majority leader or the Democratic leader in the Senate for a long time. So there's a lot of energy around socialism that just didn't exist in earlier times in American politics. So I thought it would be great to have you on, Matt, to talk a little bit about that.
Sure. Well, first off, thanks a lot for having me on. Secondly, I should say, on their kind of Republican point, it is always very funny what I see get labeled socialism or communism, because I often think that if it is true that socialism and communism is everywhere, very obviously capitalism lost the Cold War and lost it very badly, right? Since everything from, drag queen shows to, Disney is now communist in some way, shape, or form. But look, what I point out in my book is that liberalism and socialism are both very large families of views, right? And what I mean by family is there are certain kind of core resemblances between different kinds of liberalisms and different kinds of socialisms. But just like there are members of your family that you might not particularly like or might think, who the hell is that person? There are kinds of liberalism that I like that are often quite reconcilable with forms of socialism that I like. And there are forms of socialism that I think are really beyond the pale. And for that matter, also variants of liberalism like neoliberalism that I don't have a lot of good things to say about. So what I'm talking about in my book is a very specific tradition, liberal socialism. And these are people who identified both as liberals and socialists, or indeed thought that the one necessitated the other in certain kind of profound ways. And the way that I characterize the text is as a retrieval, which is a term the great Canadian political philosopher Stephen McPherson coined for looking back at a political tradition to try to recover or retrieve radical and egalitarian and emancipatory potentials in it that we might not be familiar with. And what I point out is you can trace the origins of liberal socialism intellectually, at the very least, back to people like the American revolutionary Thomas Paine or the great feminist Mary Wollstonecraft. But it really matured in the thinking of people like John Stuart Mill, John Rawls, who I know Paul is really very fond of, right? Carlo Rosselli and many others. And the book is not a defense of liberal socialism the way that, say, Theory of Justice is a defense of justice as fairness, right? I point out throughout the text that there are a lot of problems with this tradition that would need to be fixed. But I do think that liberal socialism is an inspiring version of liberalism, an aspiring version of socialism that deserves a second look in the 21st century.
No, I think that's exactly right. And I think the idea of this as a retrieval is important. Because I think there is a history that's been lost or forgotten here. And I think there's a reason that it's been kind of swept under the rug. And we'll come back to that kind of historical context, which I'm very interested in.
Sure.
But I'd really like to talk about what liberal socialism has to say to us today, not just in a historical sense, right? Because it feels like we're living through a time where great questions are once again being asked,
Mhm.
right? That the so-called neoliberal consensus, what exactly the content of that consensus is a little contested, but it seems to be pretty over with, right? And we're seeing, a very clear object lesson in the dangers of concentrated wealth. In the form of Elon Musk apparently just buying himself a government office and government oversight. So I think these are really important questions to ask again. But before we get onto the history tour, I guess I kind of want to ask you a question. So, what is liberal socialism? What is liberal socialism as distinct from non socialist liberalism? And what is liberal socialism as distinct from non liberal socialism?
Sure. Well, liberal socialism, as the name would suggest, refers to a doctrine that is committed to the achievement of economic democracy in a liberal institutional and political framework. Whether you want to call that a representative democracy or a parliamentary democracy, you choose your flavor. And by and large, I argue that liberal socialists are committed to three core principles, and I'll try to juxtapose each one against another version of liberalism, just to kind of make them clear. So, liberal socialists are committed to, first and foremost, what I call methodological collectivism and normative individualism. And what that means is liberal socialists are committed to the idea, as Aristotle, Marx, and for that matter, Martha and Nussbaum stress, that we are social animals, first and foremost. And that's the right anthropological way of looking at us. Yes, it is often the case that, as many classical liberals presupposed, we often think in individualistic terms. And absolutely, we can often be extremely self-interested and competitive in how we pursue our interests. But we are ultimately extremely dependent upon one another, from birth onwards. And the most kind of flourishing life is one that recognizes this fundamental interdependence. So that's the methodological collectivism side. The normative individualism dimension of this is that all liberal socialists argue that even though we are inherently social animals, ultimately it is the well-being of actually existent and potentially future individuals that, to use their proper term, is what matters from a moral viewpoint. And the reason this is significant is liberal socialists would deny that you can supersede the interest of the actual individuals who make up society, or for that matter, the world, in the name of some abstract collectivity. And we see this all the time, right? People will say, well, we can deny the rights of migrants because they aren't really part of our nation or our community. Well, any liberal socialist would say, actually, the rights of those actually existing individual migrants matters a lot more than your kind of very abstract concern for a reified ethno-state or this desire for white homogeneity. So this idea of a commitment to methodological collectivism and normative individualism, which are terms I take, by the way, from Tony Smith in his book Beyond Liberal Egalitarianism, is really the kind of philosophical heart, or even if you want to call it that, anthropological heart of a liberal socialist doctrine. The next principle is a commitment to a developmental rather than an acquisitive ethic. And these are terms I draw from C.P. McPherson. So an acquisitive ethic is one that you'll see in the writings of people like Thomas Hobbes, most certainly Jeremy Bentham. Some would argue many of the neoliberal thinkers, like, say, Gary Becker, although there's controversy around that. But an acquisitive ethic holds that, first and foremost, again, human beings are competitive, self-interested animals who are committed to the pursuit of their self-interests. And the best that you can really hope for is to ameliorate our fundamentally competitive drives by moving from a very deadly kind of state of nature to a market society, where something like the war of all against all will continue, except there'll be certain parameters or rules established to keep it from getting too intense. And there is no doubt that, to a certain extent, human beings are competitive, self-interested animals, and also that we gain a lot of utilitarian value from the acquisition of stuff and its use, right? But what liberal socialists counter to this is that actually human beings flourish a lot more when we focus on the development of our fundamental faculties, and there's an inherently intersubjective quality to this. So just to use an example, John Stuart Mill, right? John Stuart Mill was extremely critical of Jeremy Bentham by saying it's most certainly not the case that human beings want to be something that looks a lot like a pig satisfied because their hedonic urges are gratified. Actually, what they really would rather be is somebody like Socrates dissatisfied. Why? Because Socrates is somebody who's really developed his intellectual faculties to a high level and gets an awful lot of pleasure not only about exercising those intellectual faculties, but also exercising them with other people, engaging in debates, talking about what kind of city we should have, et cetera, et cetera. So the developmental ethic holds that we should focus our society on enabling or developing people's fundamental capacities so that they can flourish more robustly as human beings. And there are many different fundamental capacities that people might have. Some people will benefit from having their social aptitudes develop so that they can be a better husband or brother or sister or whatever it happens to be. Other people, having their musical or artistic faculties developed. All liberal socialists place a great deal of importance on the significance of developing people's intellectual capacities, for instance, by offering things like universal education, etc. But the idea is that exercising these developed capacities in an intersubjective setting is much more likely to enable people to flourish than just focusing on an ethic that encourages people to acquire as much stuff as possible so they can gratify as many of their private desires as possible. And then the last principle that liberal socialists are committed to, and then I'll stop, is just what I mentioned before, this idea that the best kind of political system to realize this developmental ethic is a liberal socialist one where we are committed to representative democratic institutions. We are very, very committed to almost all the core liberal liberties, the exception being no liberal socialist is committed to the idea that private ownership of the means of production is a good thing for pretty obvious reasons, because by contrast, they argue that we're much more likely to have a robust liberal society if the means of production are owned socially or are managed democratically, because allowing enormous concentrations of power in the hands of the oligarchs can be a serious impediment to human flourishing, and certainly to democracy.
Yeah, I just have a question about that. So, in discussions with socialists, I feel like you often get pinned on some really essentialist definition of socialism.
Sure.
That is really about that last bit there. The public ownership of the means of production. And one thing that I thought was sort of vague reading your book was just exactly how essentialist we have to be and how loosey-goosey you can be with the idea of democratic control. Like, what can that entail? What does it have to entail, and what can it entail? Versus, like, does everything have to be? Do all of the means of production have to be owned by, little communes or Soviets?
Yeah, it's a great question, and every author that I talk about in the book has a different answer to that. And I have my own inclinations on it, which we can get into later on if you want, right? And I think part of the problem is that if you look at the socialist tradition, people's responses to precisely what is meant by social ownership of the means of production is itself vague, right? Marx never really gives very clear answers about what he means by it. Edward Bernstein sometimes suggests that it just means the state will redistribute resources, et cetera, right? But I'll just give a couple of clear examples, right? So there's this kind of dogmatic view on the part of many that what socialists mean by public ownership of the means of production is invariably state ownership of the means of production, right? That the state is just going to own everything. I don't want to be clear. There are versions of socialism that have, without a doubt, called for that, right? Think about Marxist-Leninism or certainly Stalinism. And we all know where that approach to public ownership of the means of production went. It was right to the gulag, and they should be consequently rejected. But authors like John Stuart Mill, whether we're talking about public ownership or democratic or social ownership of the means of production, what they meant was, actually, workers should control the firms that they work at least over a certain kind of threshold. And Mill had various different arguments for this. One was an economic argument where he says, look, by and large, capitalists don't really do all that much at the firms that they own. They provide a little bit of technical know-how, but nothing that workers themselves can provide, probably even at a higher level of expertise since they actually work in these firms day to day. And we can expect that communes or worker-owned firms will be more likely to be economically efficient since the workers will be induced to kind of distribute amongst themselves rather than to a lot of the money end up going to the bosses, right? And then there was a moral argument that Mill gave, which is related back to his liberal principles, where he said, look, liberals are extremely critical of the idea of aristocracy because they think that there's something deeply wrong about this idea that people should be subordinated to an aristocrat. And they fought very hard against that, often successfully. But then Mill goes on to say a lot of that kind of rhetoric gets dropped almost immediately when we think about the relationship between workers and bosses, where a very similar kind of slavish attitude is induced because people are required to adopt this disposition of subordination towards their boss. And Mill, almost in a kind of macho way, says there's something unmanly and undignified about that, right? We don't want workers going into work and having to brown nose to the boss to get ahead. And collectively managed firms or worker managed firms are more likely to be egalitarian and democratic and also enable people's individuality to design precisely because there won't be these relationships of subordination. Now, this idea, of course, is extremely controversial, although there are authors that have tried to resuscitate it, notably Elizabeth Anderson, who also figures large in my book. And I think there's a lot of reasons to find it appealing.
Let's come back to that. Because I don't want to get too far into the workers' collective question. I mean, as you can see from the face I was making, I'm deeply skeptical of everything. I know workers' collectives are very popular, but it always seems to involve this commitment that they're going to be more efficient than capitalist-run firms. And if that were true, it would be very obvious. And it's also obviously not true, because we have worker-owned firms, and they are not outcompeting capitalist firms in any obvious way. But like I said, I don't really want to... We can... let me rephrase. I'd love to come back to this at the end of the episode, but I do want to talk a little bit about the history here.
Sure.
I promised to do it, and I like to keep my promises. So, you mentioned at the outset Thomas Paine, Mary Wollstonecraft, who are not really people you would normally think of as socialists, right? Thomas Paine is mostly famous for being an American revolutionary. Mary Wollstonecraft, mostly famous for being an early feminist. So in what sense do you put them in the liberal socialist tradition?
Sure. Well, the way that I characterize them is as precursors to the liberal socialist tradition. And that's because both authors take very seriously the way that stark divisions of property or stark inequalities of property distort the potential to achieve a flourishing liberal society, certainly one that's morally virtuous. So let's just start with Paine. So Paine, as you mentioned, is probably most famous, at least to American audiences, for his short and very polemical pamphlet, Common Sense, where he inveighs against the aristocracy, calls on the American people to rise up and replace the English monarchy, at least within their own territory, with a republican system of government. And this call was extremely popular, right? You know, American generals during the Revolutionary War used to read bits and pieces of Common Sense out to their soldiers in order to kind of get them riled up before the eve of battle. And there's some very funny stuff in that. But at least in Common Sense, Paine more or less comes across as a pretty standard, let's call him Lockean style liberal, right? Believes in a republican government, believes in natural rights to life, liberty, and property, albeit an author with a particular polemical talent that many of us aren't gifted with. But he started to change his tune a little bit by the time of the second half of The Rights of Man. So The Rights of Man, for those who don't know, is Paine's second great work, which also was enormously popular at the time. And he wrote it, the first half, as a defense of the French Revolution against Edmund Burke, who, as everyone knows, wrote a book-length critique of the French Revolution, Reflections on the Revolution in France. And Paine saw it as important to respond comprehensively to the criticisms that Burke made in this book. But the more important part for my purposes is the second half of The Rights of Man, which is released somewhat later, where Paine starts to suggest very strongly that actually if we are going to be committed to Republican and liberal principles, we need to go further than, say, someone like John Locke would countenance, at least in the traditional reading. And one of the reasons for this is Paine comes around to the idea that property is, in fact, not a natural right or not a natural institution. In his terminology, it's very much a social institution, and consequently, people who own tremendous amounts of property owe a debt to society, and in particular the poor, for the preservation of the social institution of property. Sometimes he even goes further than this and suggests that the rich, precisely by accumulating an enormous amount of property and things like land for themselves, have dispossessed the rest of humankind over what was once held in common. And so they also owe a debt to everyone else, particularly the poor. And the way he suggested this debt can be paid is through very high levels of taxation that would go to fund, certainly by 18th century standards, a very generous welfare state. So this would include things like a universal inheritance for all upon reaching the age of maturity, funds for women who gave birth precisely in order to kind of thank them for child rearing and also to give their kids a head start, guaranteed employment at a very high level, right? And he's very insistent upon this, right? These should be quality jobs that you can leave wherever you want, where you're well compensated, an old age pension, and some people even attributed to them this idea of something like a universal basic income, or the proto idea of a universal basic income.
Yeah, so you can see here, right, that the property question
That's right.
is kind of central to this whole theme, right, that he's writing against thinkers like Locke, for whom property is kind of sacrosanct. Right, this is like what these days people will call like the classical liberal tradition that says rights to contract, rights to property are among like the fundamental rights that the state should never interfere with. And for a lot of the classicals, that means you got to be really careful with taxation. Like, we're going to have some, but we're not going to have the wrong kinds of taxation. And this is just like, yeah, we're going to do a lot of taxation. We're going to have a lot of social welfare.
At least of the rich.
Yes, at least for the rich. The details are always going to be kind of contentious here. So yeah, I mean, I think that's really interesting. In what respect is Wollstonecraft part of this tradition?
Before you answer, Matt, I had a quick comment that I think might help set the stage for set the context. So both Mary Wollstonecraft and Thomas Paine are before either liberalism or socialism were like self-aware movements.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's sort of important to, like, of course, Thomas Paine and Mary Wollstonecraft weren't liberal socialists, right? Because they weren't really technically liberals in some sense. You know, I mean, I think it's fine to call them liberals. And so therefore they couldn't be, liberal socialists either. Sorry, go ahead, Matt.
No, I think that's right, to acknowledge the way that like the construction of an intellectual history is oftentimes a construction, right? We look backwards and we say, oh, this person belongs because they're contributing important ideas because they influenced this. But did they call themselves that? Did they recognize themselves as part of that tradition? Sometimes, but other times not so much. So yeah, I guess, would you elaborate a bit on Wollstonecraft and where she does or doesn't fit in this tradition?
Yeah, of course. And I want just to say to Paul's point, you're absolutely right that there's a lot of debate about when liberalism began as a distinct intellectual tradition, and there's also debates about when socialism began as a distinct intellectual tradition. I mean, sometimes authors like Karl Popper imply that you can trace the roots of communism and socialism back to Plato and the Republic, right? Or for that matter, the laws, right? With these calls for the abolition of private property, or at least in the laws, the idea that no person should own more than 4 times as much as anyone else, right? Or the typical reference point for liberalism as a self-aware doctrine is actually usually in Spain, where in the early 19th century, different political factions started referring to themselves as los liberales, right? The liberals who are opposed to monarchical rule by the quite autocratic Spanish monarchy. But again, you can trace liberalism back further, going all the way back to ancient Athens and Socrates, and this idea, that you find in Thucydides of, we pride ourselves on our freedom and we don't, begrudge people the right to say what they want. It's up to you, right? There's always a little bit of selectivity in how you define these traits. Anyway, my professor moment done there. I will say that Wollstonecraft is actually one of the thinkers that I was really delighted to talk about in this book, because I think that she's sometimes underappreciated as a political thinker with an expansive array of views, right? The thing that we're always taught in college is, she argued that women should get the same rights as men. Certainly from a 21st century standpoint, at least once upon a time before the rise of the hard right, that was kind of a duh thing. But actually, she had a lot of different interests in a wide array of subject matters, right? She wrote a wonderful critique of Edmund Burke's Reflections on the Revolution of France, talking about the importance of things like Republican rights, and accusing him of having a mortal antipathy to reason, because he was so fixated on these kind of Gothic affects and this irrational attachment to things as they once were, rather than recognizing what they could be. But in terms of the socialism question, Wollstonecraft was extremely insistent throughout all of her work that, as she put it in A Vindication of the Rights of Women, it's from this reverence for property, as though from a poisoned chalice, that almost all the major distortions of our moral virtues emerge. And the reason for this is, again, very much like Mill. She says, look, this attitude people take of reverencing the rich and attribute to them these almost supernatural moral qualities is extremely corrosive of social solidarity. And it's almost as bad as the attitude that the rich and elites themselves take, which is that they owe nothing to the people at the bottom because Clearly, the people at the bottom deserve to be where they are, whereas they themselves, the rich and the property and the elites in society, must have done something to warrant their position. And so, the best thing in the world and the best thing for society, of course, would be to reward them for their moral virtues by ensuring they can accumulate more wealth and more power for themselves. And she was very insistent about this over the course of all of her work, right? So. A lot of her most famous writings come from the period of the French Revolution, where she was very clearly challenging aristocratic forms of property ownership, which I should add any liberal should be sympathetic towards, right? But even when in the early 19th century, when she was writing her letters from the Nordic states and from northern Germany, she starts to talk about proto-industrialists emerging in cities like Hamburg and Frankfurt and stuff. And she describes the kind of bourgeois rich as a species of fungus, saying they're kind of popping up like mushrooms all over the place. And in some ways, they are actually worse than the old aristocrats, who at least felt this sense of noblesse obligée towards the lower orders every now and then, because these are people for whom the profit motive is everything. They look with suspicion upon anyone who ascribes higher motivations to individuals or society. And their way of thinking about the world is purely calculative, right? Where is my next buck going to come from, and how do I get it? And how do I screw the other person out of getting it first, right? And she says, if this is the kind of model that our society is going to try to emulate, then boy, oh boy, are we going to be in big trouble down the line, because it's an extremely shallow and vacuous way of life. And she didn't want that, right? She wanted liberal societies to be much more committed to virtuous, intersubjective, and holistic modes of being than what you saw in these kind of vulgar bourgeois attitudes. Now, sadly, she died very young, giving birth to Mary Shelley, right, the author of Frankenstein. So we're not really sure where she would have gone had she been able to develop any of these thoughts further, which I should add, I think is an extreme tragedy for the history of political thought, because if you read her writings, I think she was really just kind of gaining steam and moving up to some great opuses that she might have had time to write. But, we can certainly infer from a lot of this that had she lived into the era of the 1820s or 1830s, when socialist and workers' movements were beginning to gain some steam and gain some momentum, I've no doubt she would have at least been sympathetic to some of the inclinations.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think this is, there's a little strain here that I'm always kind of inclined to pick up on, where people are critics of capitalism because they see it as shallow. And I guess this gets back to your second point about the difference between an acquisitive and a capabilities approach, developmentalist approach. And I'm always a little bit skeptical of this line because it does so easily turn into snobbery.
Oh, yes.
Right? And I'm always in that kind of snobbery can lead you in illiberal directions to say, well, yeah, that's what the mass of people want, but they're all wrong. Right, I know what the higher form of life is, and therefore we need to blah blah blah. So I think, I don't know, it gets to the sense in which these are always messy political traditions.
If I could just interject on this, I'm glad you brought that up, because actually that's something I bring up in the chapter on Wollstonecraft, which is a perennial problem with not just Wollstonecraft and Mill, but pretty much every liberal socialist author, is precisely this kind of sense of intellectual elitism coupled with egalitarianism that they'll sometimes adopt. Which I say actually can explain a lot of some of the contemporary left attitudes that people resent, right? Because Wollstonecraft was enormously sympathetic towards the poor and wanted society to do it a lot more to help them. But number one on our list was we need more education, because a lot of the poor have extremely vulgar tastes and extremely vulgar attitudes. And this is precisely why we need to educate them to become responsible Republican citizens. And John Stuart Mill, who I have nothing but praise for in most respects. We can get to his imperialism later, which I don't. Same kind of attitude, right? We should have a more democratic society. People should be more involved in their own self-governance, including in the economy. But we desperately need to educate them, because if you talk to the average man on the street, it's very clear that he don't know squat, right? And I think this inclination on the part of many liberal socialists, or liberals generally, to imagine that education is just a cure-all for all the things that ail us is itself indicative of a kind of intellectual snobbery and definitely a kind of soft epistocratic attitude in the case of the subjects that I talk about. I'm personally committed to the idea that the developmental ethic you talked about applies as much to helping people get better at hockey as it does getting better at reading Plato, right? I think that we should try to help facilitate people's capabilities so that they can flourish as the kind of person they are, not necessarily the kind of person that we wish they would be, which in many cases is a kind of miniature Socrates.
Yeah, no, I think there's a little vein here, a little vein of truth in the sense in which people sometimes call liberals condescending
Sure.
or hypocritical, right? It's like, oh yeah, you care so much for the poor, but you really don't seem to like them that much, right? And that's something that, yeah, you can see it throughout the tradition, and especially, like you say, in Mill,
Oh, yeah.
right? And he's the author of Liberal Socialism, a book that's just called Liberal Socialism. And so, I mean, you could see as the is
That's
that right?
Carlo Rosselli wrote the
Oh,
book
I'm
Liberal
so sorry.
Socialism. Mill did write a book called Socialism, which, if you read, actually turns out to be very pro-socialism in some respects, although there's a lot of prescient critiques of authoritarian versions of socialism there as well, right? But, I mean, he proudly designated himself a socialist in his autobiography, worked really hard to combine liberalism and socialism in certain interesting ways.
Yeah, so why don't you tell us a little bit about Mill's place in this tradition?
Sure. Well, I'm always encouraged to shamelessly plug liberal currents here by saying you can go read
You
my
can
review of.
always shamelessly plug liberal currents on this podcast. It is always morally correct.
Absolutely, and I should say thanks to the magazine for being so supportive of my work over the years, and also dealing with all the spelling mistakes that inevitably occur in any of my articles, right? But anyway, so Helen McCabe's book, John Stuart Mill's Socialist, is very good on this. I'd encourage everyone to check it out. It's probably the most comprehensive guide, but Mill himself was very clear about why he came around to socialism in his autobiography, where he says early on in his life he was more or less committed to a classical liberal outlook because he had failed to see there's possible gold beyond that, when he was young. Then, under the influence of people like Saint-Simon, the Owenites, and most certainly his wife, itself kind of controversial how much of a role she played, he came around to, as he put it, proudly classify himself under the general designation of socialist. But what's notable about Mill is he refuses to identify with any of the emerging socialist sects at the time and really develops his own way of approaching socialism. So there are a lot of different arguments he puts forward for socialism, both in his book Socialism and also in later editions of the Principles of Political Economy. I already gestured to one about worker communes. We can litigate that later on if you want. I'll focus on the arguments in his socialism text instead. So one of the major arguments that he puts forward for socialism in this book is precisely that it would be more liberal to move in a socialist direction. Because he says, look, the reality is that for most poor people, certainly living in 19th century England, this idea that we live in a more free and more prosperous society just kind of seems like a bad joke, right? The reality is that reforms have not kept up with liberal principles because many people who are poor live lives of astonishing deprivation and pretty much don't think of themselves as free because they are bound to go to work for 12, 14 hours a day, even when that's not necessary given what we know about economic laws right now. And I think that's a powerful argument. But his more persuasive one for me actually takes aim in a kind of proto-Rawlsian vein at this idea of meritocracy or desert that so many liberals then as now, or at least neoliberals now appeal to. Where Mill said, look, I constantly hear all this rhetoric about how those who do not work shall not eat, or how riches and prosperity need to correspond with reward. But he says it's very odd then that the people who do almost all the essential jobs in society, motherhood, working in coal mines, building roads, doing cleaning chimneys, cleaning toilets, whatever, they have jobs that are extremely poorly remunerated and also looked down upon, right? Despite the fact that people need to work extremely hard at those jobs. And jobs like being a politician, let alone being an aristocrat, that are extremely prestigious and very well remunerated, actually involve an awful lot less work, and in some ways are an awful lot less vital to the everyday flourishing of society than what the very poor do. So he said, if we actually took this idea of hard work being proportionate to reward seriously, we'd have a very different kind of society than the one we do. But we don't have that because the rich do not have any kind of incentive to actually undertake the meaningful reforms that are necessary to build a society that lives up to the very principles that they themselves espouse when they're kind of drawing on these bourgeois themes. So the argument is a little bit underdeveloped, I think, in Mill compared to what you're later going to see in people like Rawls, who I like, and I know Paul doesn't, right? But it's very persuasive, right? And stressing how if we actually take a lot of these liberal values about hard work, effort, etc., seriously, it would lead us in the direction of thinking that we need to do an awful lot more for the poor than we're doing right now. And we're not taking that seriously because the rich have no interest in us taking those arguments seriously if that actually is going to bite them in the ass in terms of their interests.
Yeah, I think that's right. That this again gets to the ways that extreme. I mean, obviously, Britain in the time Mill is writing is characterized by very striking inequalities of wealth and power in ways that are also like very tightly tied to to social hierarchy.
Oh yeah.
Right, the kind of class system that is still quite present in Britain, right? And the sense that these the sense that many people had at the time that these inequalities of wealth were warping society both in material ways, right, in terms of the deprivation of ordinary citizens, that there was an abundance in one place and an enormous impoverishment in other places, and at the same time that they were warping the social order of society, right? That people were walking around like, like they were natural aristocrats because their daddy was rich, right? And in a sense that is in conflict with these kinds of egalitarian democratic values that
I mean, if you look at Elon Musk and the Trump kids today, a lot has changed since then, right?
Yeah, clearly a totally different world we're living in. So yeah, I think whatever. I think that's an interesting read of Mill there. Again, one that is not taught as much, right? If you read Mill, you'll read utilitarianism. Maybe you'll read On Liberty. You will not, almost very few people will wind up reading in college courses, socialism or his more socialist texts. So I think this is an important recovery. And I guess I want to ask again, while we're doing this kind of a lightning tour, I apologize for the lightningness of the lightning tour through history. This character you mentioned earlier, Edward Bernstein, because he's going to be a nice pivot into this big historical turn that I want to talk about, and why this whole history has kind of been forgotten. So why don't you tell us a little bit about Edward Bernstein?
Sure. Well, in order to discuss that, I need to very, very briefly talk a bit about Marx, since he was...
one must always be talking about Marx.
Yes, exactly. Even if one does not want to. Although I like Marx. I mean, I'm not going to be shy about saying that. Made mistakes, but a lot of insights there. Anyway, after Marx died, there was this intense debate about the nature of his legacy, in no small part because Marx's texts, as you might know, contradict themselves on various points. Like, should we pursue militant revolutionary change, or will reform get the job done? And the standard reading now, I should say, is that in his earlier days, around 1848, Marx seems to have been pretty committed to the idea that only a violent revolution that's kind of analogous to the French Revolution is going to be capable of bringing about a socialist or communist society. By the 1870s, 1880s, he seems to have come around to the idea that in democratic societies where workers are being enfranchised, it might be possible to pursue a parliamentary or democratic route to socialism. All that aside, these debates were intensely fraught in the German left, and for that matter, in the broader European left through the 19th century. And they really split a lot of natal socialist and left-wing parties down the middle. And Bernstein was at the epicenter of that. So he was a member of the German Social Democratic Party, which was inarguably at the time the most powerful socialist party in Europe. And there were some in the Social Democratic Party who believed that reform could bring about a more or less socialist society, and those who believe, like, say, Rosa Luxemburg, that only violent...
Can I interject here to say,
sure.
Can we get like a time check here on, are we 1880s? Are we 1870s?
Oh, no, this would be the early 20th century, right? Prior to the First World War, but certainly after Engels' death.
Okay,
right?
So because Marx died in like the 1870s or 1880s, I think.
1883.
So Bernstein is coming he's going to be talking in the early 20th century. Okay, I got it.
Yeah, exactly, right. And Bernstein himself was a friend of Engels, and this is one of the reasons this is also intensified, because Marxists then and as now have a bad habit of sometimes treating Marx's text as though they're something akin to scripture, right? So you really get these kind of scholastic debates about, well, what did the old man really mean when he said this? And the fact that Bernstein was friends with Engels and had been trusted to interpret Marx by Engels gave his word more weight than it might have otherwise had. But anyway, so Bernstein, in the midst of all these debates, writes a book that's usually translated as The Preconditions of Socialism. And this book, if you read it, is a pretty scholarly, reform-minded text. So it can be hard, I think, for people to appreciate just how enormously controversial it was in the early 20th century, where socialists all across Europe started to become afraid with being called Bernsteinian or being shills for the capitalist class like Bernstein, right? And, this is partly, again, reflective of this bad tendency on the part of leftists to focus, I think, too excessively on the narcissism, small differences. But Bernstein said, this is just very briefly, look, Marx is clearly a great genius, has an awful lot of insights, but there are certain fundamental problems, at least with the orthodox reading of his theory. The orthodox reading of his theory is that socialism is going to come about because the contradictions of capitalism are inevitably going to induce crises. The working class will rise up and produce a society where the free development of each is a precondition for the free development of all. Bernstein says this kind of teleological reading of economics is just a complete non-starter, right? And then, interestingly enough, Bernstein was also very critical of at least dogmatic readings of the labor theory of value, or this idea that socially necessary labor time is at the basis of exchange value. And partly this was because he was responsive to the criticisms of Marxism by proto-Austrian economics or economists, right? Like Bombayer work. And so he says, look, you do not need to lean on this idea that socially necessary labor time is the basis of exchange value to be committed to socialism, or the idea that workers are exploited, right? There are other ways of kind of making this argument that don't depend on a kind of weird economic metaphysics. Now, whether or not this is a correct reading of Marx or even orthodox Marxism aside, the conclusion Bernstein makes is that we can approach socialism from what's sometimes called an evolutionary standpoint, which means trying to pursue reforms within a liberal parliamentary system that will eventually produce a society where the goods of the world are distributed more equally, and where genuine emancipation and freedom is available to all, including the poor. And Bernstein had a lot of praise for liberalism, and even tried to genealogically connect socialism to liberalism by saying things like, look, in many ways, socialism is a continuation of this liberal project of emancipating everybody and securing liberty, equality, and fraternity for all. It takes more seriously the need to do that in terms of economic relations than classical liberals did. And socialists are also the heirs to liberalism in the sense that they want to challenge existing hierarchies and relations of power. But again, recognizing that these hierarchies and relations of power can also be established in a capitalist economy, the same way that earlier liberals recognized how they can instantiate themselves within political systems, such as the Ancien regime. So many positive things to say about liberalism in Bernstein's book, although again, arguing that these kind of principles need to be extended in a more economic direction. And I think that there's a lot that's valuable there.
No, I think that again gets to this point about a democratic socialism or a liberal socialism, right? That he's working towards, right? He's working with the property question. He's challenging liberalism on, he's not even really coming he's coming from a Marxist tradition about the understanding of ownership of the means of production, but he's saying we have to do it in a liberal way. We have to work through democratic politics. And this is the point where I'm gonna tell a story about something that happens in the early 20th century, something that happens in the world that changes our understanding of history and of intellectual history. And I'll tell a story, and then maybe after I'm done, you can tell me how plausible you think it sounds.
Sure.
Right, which is that in 1917, the entire world is at war. In particular, the Tsarist regime in Russia is at war. Millions of Russians have died and are continuing to die in enormous numbers. The regime, there's mass suffering, mass deprivation, a crisis of confidence in the regime, in the Tsar, who is not popular or competent. There's a crisis of confidence in the Tsar among the elites, and the whole regime just kind of implodes quite suddenly. Where there's popular unrest just catches fire, and there's popular unrest everywhere, and the Tsar just abdicates, and the so-called provisional government takes over, and there's a lot of chaos. And into this chaos steps Vladimir Lenin, right? Lenin, who beforehand was in Geneva, right? He's in Switzerland, he's in Geneva, basically writing blog posts in cafes to put a modern spin on it.
I've always said that Lenin would be fucking phenomenal on social media right now. You can just imagine him being on Twitter like 24/7.
No, I think that's absolutely correct. And I think that's key to understanding like what happens next, basically, which is that he gets on a train to Russia Germany kind of puts him on a train to Russia because they say, this guy, he's going to go to Russia and he's going to post so much and it's going to mess them up, which is good for us because we are at war with Russia. And it works, right? Lenin goes to Russia, and in the chaos and the political uncertainty of 1917, he is always the man with a plan, right? He is always able to read the situation very clearly and to push for kinds of political changes, to have a clear political platform. And he and his movement take over from the provisional government. In the October Revolution, they win against all the other left or liberal factions. They win a very bloody civil war against the White Russians. They consolidate power in Russia. Lenin dies, and Stalin, after him, continues to consolidate power and becomes a world superpower committed to world communist revolution. And so these are events that happen in history, and I think are in some ways highly contingent, right? That there are versions of the chaos of 1917 that don't end with Lenin on top. But the one that we got did, and Lenin, and how to put it, you can't argue with success, right? And the fact that Lenin and Stalin have taken Russia to world power status, that they've finally done the thing that socialists have been trying to do for decades now, which is have a socialist revolution and take over a country, they do it. And so as a result, this kind of forecloses a lot of debates within socialism, right? That characters like Edward Bernstein kind of get marginalized because it's well, obviously he was wrong about the whole reform thing, and violent revolution is the answer, right? And at the same time, the Cold War forecloses a lot of the debates within liberalism, right? That if you're a liberal writing in the West, you really can't be a communist, right? Especially in the early Cold War, after the Red Scares, all this, what we've been calling the property question, these questions about distribution of property, you really can't touch those. Or if you do, you have to be really careful. Right. And so this, as a result, is why we don't talk about Mill as a socialist thinker, but we only talk about him as a liberal thinker. Right. This is why characters like Paine and Wollstonecraft, we don't really talk so much about what they have to say about the distribution of wealth. We just talk about what they have to say about human rights. Right. Because that's more favorable to the liberal order. But the Soviet Union is dead and buried, right? At this point, now, decades and decades later, the sheen has worn off the Soviet project. They've collapsed. They are no longer an ideological enemy that we have to define ourselves against. And so I think this has really reopened this history and reopened this debate, both within socialism and within liberalism, right? About, can you work through democracy to achieve socialism? And if so, can you do that in a liberal way? Is it liberal to talk about these kinds of distributional questions in a very serious way?
Yeah, I think that's a very well put story. I should say, I just recently downloaded the World War I mod for Hadavarian. So when you started with all that, I was thinking oh yeah, there are other alternatives. I know I've lived a couple of them recently, right? And it's weird.
Yeah, just click that button on the focus tree.
Yeah, exactly, right. But in terms of what you're talking about, I'd like to focus a little bit more on the last part of your story, because I think that's what's very important, right? As I mentioned at the beginning, liberalism and socialism are extremely expansive families, right? And there are many different wings and factions within them. And one of the things that Helena Rosenblatt points out in her Lost History of Liberalism text is, if you were to go back to the 19th century, a lot of people wouldn't have been surprised if you identified as a liberal socialist or as somebody who was committed to liberalism and socialism in many different countries, right? Think about the Solidarism movement in France, or within the SPD itself, right? If you think about people like Bernstein. It was really, as you point out, the Cold War that hardened these differences and made it very, very difficult to claim that you're committed to both liberalism and socialism, because by and large, the expectation was that if you are committed to liberal principles, that means you must be committed to an open society, to use the Popperian term. And that meant that you were by definition opposed to a closed society, which was identified with communism and socialism and collectivism, etc. And a lot of the bifurcations that emerged at this time are still very much with us, right? I still see people all the time online identifying as classical liberals because they're individualist rather than collectivists, right? Even though F.A. Hayek himself, certainly by the 1960s, was talking about the importance of collective institutions and collective ideas like civilization, culture, et cetera, right? So in terms of why it is that these attempts to reconcile or conciliate between liberalism and socialism have never really been foregrounded, I definitely think that a lot of it is due to the Cold War. And I don't want to be conspiratorial here, right? It's not like you would go into, you go read the collected works of John Stuart Mill and all the sections about why I'm a socialist are just blanked out or something, a Patrick style. It's just that these weren't foregrounded any longer. Or if you read text from the time, sometimes liberals would give, or liberal commentators, conservative commentators, would have an embarrassed footnote where they'd be like, yeah, Mill made these kind of comments, and yeah, Paine made these kind of comments, but they didn't really mean it, and if they did, then it was just because they didn't realize that they were wrong, and we can move on from now. And I think certainly in 2025, it's actually long past time to take a second look at this, because I do think that there are good reasons to follow Mill, to follow Paine, to follow Rawls, to follow Rosselli, and saying, if you are committed to liberty, equality, and solidarity in the political realm, there's something that is extremely problematic about being disinterested in liberty, equality, and solidarity in the economic realm, especially because most people will spend far more of their time interacting with each other through the economy or just spending time at work than they will interacting with the state. Now, I want to be extremely clear. I am emphatically opposed to any form of command economic system, let alone an authoritarian political system. I think that there's nothing worse in the entire world and nothing more gloomy than the prospect that we're all going to wind up looking like communist China, for instance, right now, with a social credit system. But I think that if you look at models like Norway, Sweden, and Denmark, which are often ones that I pointed to, these are highly flourishing liberal societies that have found ways of offsetting a lot of the worst propensities of capitalism by solidaristically providing a very robust set of welfare institutions for everybody, while also empowering labor. And I think that there are reasons to imagine we could go further still, something of a radical that way. But I say, if you're trying to build a rocket to Mars, hopefully not one that's designed by Elon, right? You don't sit there and say, well, the rockets we've had so far have only gotten to the moon, so let's start from scratch. Instead, you say, well, they've gotten to the moon. Let's see if we can go further still by building upon those achievements.
Yeah, so I think the invocation of China is interesting here. The social credit score is a little bit oversold, right? It sounds very scary, so it kind of went viral in the West, but it's not necessarily the primary way that the Chinese government controls the economy. And what's interesting is the way that the current iteration of the CCP has pursued a command economy with capitalist characteristics, in the sense that they they absolutely clearly do believe in controlling the commanding heights of the economy. And for them, that's the financial system. Mm-hmm. That is the banking system. And that you can control who gets credit and on what terms is how you shape among other, there are many, many ways, but it's one of the big ways is how you shape the industrial system of your country by controlling which industries get loans. But then you don't have, Comrade Commissar saying you need to do exactly this with your car manufacturing line. You just kind of let the market sort it out, right, as to which company is going to turn out to be the best at making electric cars, and it's BYD. It turns out it's BYD in China is the one that emerges from a pretty brutal process of competition, and then the state is happy to say, yeah, and you're just going to keep on getting credit, and we will, at very, very favorable terms, and that'll keep you going. And it's interesting to contrast this with the kind of, socialism with capitalist characteristics that you see in the Nordic countries that you're talking about. And I was wondering if you could elaborate on why you think the Nordic system is better here, what kind of differences you see here.
Sure. Well, I think one of the big differences is precisely the empowerment of labor, which is something that you characteristically don't actually see in China, right? Irregardless of whatever it is that they call themselves, right? The Chinese have been extremely militant in opposing things like labor organization, let alone unionization. even characterizing it as unpatriotic, right? So not something that I think any genuine socialist, let alone a communist, should be thinking. But in terms of, I think, what's valuable about the Nordic approach, historian Sejersted points out in his history of Norway, Nordic and Swedish social democracy, that what is sometimes called Scandinavian, or the Scandinavian variant of socialism, was centered around this idea of creating what he calls a people's home, where everyone would be invested in the well-being of one another, because everyone would make a contribution to one another's well-being. And this was at the philosophical epicenter of creating these very robust welfare states that you see there, that provision things like universal pensions, very high quality public education, of course, universal healthcare, and of course, unemployment insurance, labor retraining, et cetera, et cetera. But another characteristic of them was this very strong emphasis on the importance of things like unionization and labor movements. So, for instance, the Swedish Social Democratic Party was deeply aligned with workers' movements in the early 20th century, and they formed the mainstay of its political support well into the 1950s, which is one of the reasons why, if you look at Sweden, Norway, and Denmark, they have far higher rates of unionization than we do in the United States, and have for generations now. Even after the neoliberal turn, Sweden contemporarily has 69 to 70% union density, right, compared with 8 to 9% in the United States. And I think that this has really enabled workers to be empowered to agitate for more rights, more voice, and better wages for themselves. And it really offsets the power of capital in the workplace. Now, more ambitious social democrats like Olaf Palme in the 19th century, in the 1970s, imagine it might be possible again to go further through things like the Meidner Plan and actually allow workers to take control peacefully of the firms that they worked at. We don't need to get too much into this. But again, I certainly think that the model that was developed there is a positive one to look to going forward, because they seem to have very successfully combined a highly egalitarian economy with a commitment to liberal and democratic rights that actually, in some ways, puts many other Western democracies to shame, if you look at things like freedom indices.
No, I think that's right. And I think it's interesting because this is a model that is not, it's like you say, it's not really about, a command economy. It's not about, ownership of the means of production necessarily, but it's about workers as a political bloc, unions as a political bloc, right? That, you can have how to put this, a tax and spend redistribution system is one thing, but by itself, it's not doesn't necessarily have its own political bloc attached to it, as we've seen in America, right? And that it is by having workers as a self-conscious, well-organized collective that you have a political counterweight to the political weight of wealth inequality.
Yeah, and I should add that there's sometimes this mystique or misconception that socialists are fundamentally opposed to markets. There are many variants of market socialism out there, and the tradition of market socialism goes all the way back to people like Robert Owen, or for that matter, John Stuart Mill, or Saint-Simon, right? What socialists, by and large, are opposed to is capitalism, which is not the same as a free market, right? Precisely, and many socialists are opposed to capitalism precisely because they think the monopolistic propensities of capitalism can itself become an impediment to the robust flourishing of the market, because we can because monopolists can edge out competition, and thus lead to declining services provided to consumers, et cetera, et cetera. And I think what you see in the Nordic states is a really adept effort to combine many valuable features of market society, again, with a high level of commitment to state provision of basic services, very, very strong labor movements that translates into powerful unions. And it's an extremely positive model to look at going forward, particularly in our current era, where we're seeing a very serious oligarchic assault on the basic tenets and indeed basic institutions of liberal democracy, which I actually think vindicate a lot of the 19th century socialist concerns, and for that matter, Marxist concerns about the long-term compatibility of a system that allows the endless concentration of wealth and power with these basic liberal and basic democratic institutions and practices.
Yeah, which concerns were also present in a lot of the early liberals.
That's absolutely right. Yeah.
So the question of capitalism, I'm glad you brought that up, because that's another point of confusion, I feel like, in a lot of these discussions, because capitalism, for a lot of people on the liberal side of the equation, they have pretty, I don't know, anodyne definitions of capitalism or understandings of capitalism, where capitalism just means markets. It means like entrepreneurial, like private entrepreneurial activity, private ownership, but it's perfectly compatible with like significant labor movements and redistribution. That would still be capitalism for a lot of liberals. Can you comment on that?
Yeah,
Because I feel like that's a real sticking point that is almost like a sharp divide between socialists and liberals.
well, I think actually it's interesting. You see tensions on this point, even in the writings of the Austrian economist, right? Sometimes they'll try to present capitalism as transhistorical and latent to human nature, and they'll point out that markets have always existed. At other points, they'll try to say, well, actually, no, capitalism only appeared in the 17th or the 18th century, and precisely because it appeared, that's why countries like England and the United States became extraordinarily successful at such a rapid degree, and such a short degree of time, right? And these two kind of positions are to a certain extent incompatible with one another. But look, markets have been around forever, right? People have always bartered and traded with one another, and I don't imagine that's ever going to stop. And I don't think I'd really want it to stop, right? I think it's pretty useful when I can post something in my buildings chat about how we have a chair for sale, and if people want to come get it, then for $20, they can take it off our hands, and we all benefit from that, right? Utility maximization. Capitalism, or at least the way that socialists understand it, is a system where capitalists own the means of production, and consequently, the vast majority of people are compelled to enter into a wage-labor relationship with capitalists, where they are required to sell their labor for a certain period of time for a wage that'll ultimately be dictated by market forces, or, in some monopolistic circumstances by the capitalists themselves. And for all the reasons that I've mentioned before, socialists are deeply wary of the long-term implications of adopting this system, because I think allowing these enormous concentrations of wealth and power and status in the hands of capitalists is fundamentally incompatible with a commitment to liberty, equality, and solidarity, and also, for that matter, incompatible with liberal democracy in the long term, because the capitalists are able to acquire an awful lot of wealth and power in their hands. They're not really going to have much use for democratic institutions if it's going to impede them concentrating more wealth and power in their hands. And you don't need to take my word for it. This is exactly the point that John Rawls makes in Justice is Fairness, a Restatement, right, where he says that in a capitalist society, people do not get fair or equal value from their political liberties, and enormous concentrations of economic wealth will invariably lead to enormous concentrations of political power in the hands of the few, and that's also inconsistent with a commitment to basic liberal principles. So in my version of liberal socialism, call it market socialism if you want, I think that there will certainly be markets in a large number of goods. Certainly consumer goods seem to be very, very, very well regulated by market systems and pricing systems. Nonetheless, I think it's entirely possible that it might be valuable to decommodify the provision of certain goods, like healthcare, like education, potentially also certain aspects of housing, in order to provision quality housing to the poor, right? And I think we can experiment with how far we can go with this.
Yeah, so I think I kind of want to put in a little bit of a pitch for markets here, but I'm going to kind of pitch it like a fairy tale.
Sure.
That market, like you say, markets are quite ancient, but something changed, right? Within the last couple hundred years, something happens in England, in Northern Europe, it spreads out from there, that generates an extraordinary amount of economic growth, right? That generates an immense improvement in the living conditions of people. And this is something like capitalism or liberal democratic capitalism, but it definitely seems connected with markets in some way. And it's kind of like a magic monster, because the magic monster will deliver you enormous wealth. But if you let the magic monster just do anything it wants, it's going to eat your house and then itself, right? And we've seen this. We obviously see that our democracy in this country is under attack by oligarchs. We've seen what happened in Russia,
Yeah.
right, where oligarchs functionally ate the economy and then the political system. And they no longer have liberal democracy in Russia. And in many ways, they don't seem to have a free market, a capitalist free market either. They have an oligarchically controlled economy that is highly corrupt and doesn't grow particularly well. Right. And so I see in the time we're living in, we're once again we're realizing the kinds of dangers that the magic monster poses to our house, and asking again these important questions about, well, how exactly do you put a leash on it while still getting all the stuff out of it that it does very much provide for us? And I think recovering the liberal socialist canon is an important part of that conversation, right? And recognizing that people who have gone before us have approached these questions, have confronted these problems, and it's good to try and learn from the past if we can.
Yeah, absolutely. And I just want to say, you don't even need to be a radical to recognize the insights that you're talking about. Just give two examples. Well-known communists Adam Smith and Milton Friedman were very much concerned about the same, right? Adam Smith and The Wealth of Nations, particularly the latter bits that almost nobody reads, said, look, the reality is that the tradesmen almost always talk about everyone else's advantage and never their ours. Whenever they assemble together, it is almost always in order to form a conspiracy against the public. And you should never be convinced that tradesmen are that committed to the free market, because they are committed to profits. And if failing to be committed to the market is going to increase their profits because they can hemorrhage state or political influence to their advantage, by God, they're going to do it, right? And Milton Friedman made the same points in the 1950s and 60s, where he said, it's not necessarily clear that capitalists will necessarily be the most pro-capitalist group out there, because if they can integrate themselves into the state and use the state in order to advance their objectives by preventing things like competition from emerging, by God, they're going to do that, right? Because why would capitalists want to compete for market share when they can use the state in order to inhibit that, right? So you don't need to be even a liberal socialist, I think, to recognize the problems that you're talking about. And I think it's only for a lot of it's because of a lot of very bad cultural tendencies that the wisdom of these kinds of figures like Friedman and Smith and the whole liberal socialist canon have been forgotten.
So I have a question about this canon, by the way. So we are talking about the liberal socialist canon, singular. But one thing that I've been thinking a lot while I'm doing my own research on liberal socialism and reading your book is there are really two sorts of canons, right? There's the liberal canon, and I feel like a lot of the liberals that you talk about in your book, they're groping towards something, right? And then you have the socialists with their own canon, with their own language, which is very different in a lot of ways than the liberal language, and they're groping towards something else, right? So Edward Bernstein is groping towards liberalism, or groping toward liberal socialism, what we're talking about, and the liberals on their side are doing the same thing, but it's like two different kinds of languages. And I feel like, do you get the sense that, is it two different languages? Is it two different traditions? Is there a singular liberal socialism, or is it I'm not even sure how to frame this question, but is it a big problem that there seems to be a communicative divide between these two?
Well, I think the two languages and the two outlooks are less divided than one might expect. And this is probably a good place to end, because I can kind of connect it with some of the other things that I write about. So I spend a lot of my time, as you know, researching and writing and reading conservative and right-wing philosophers. And one of the things that is very clear when you read the conservative tradition is that conservatives are committed to very different principles, and the right is committed to very different principles than either liberals or socialists. Liberals and socialists have always been aligned on the idea that the best kind of society is a free and equal society where each individual is going to be able to flourish to the extent possible. Now, they have differed very widely on how to go about instantiating such a society, although they often come together in traditions like liberal socialism. But, in terms of core principles, I think there's a lot of overlap there. This is very different than the core commitments of the political right, which, as Hayek has pointed out, is not committed to this idea that it is important for each individual to be a free and equal member of society. They are committed to this idea that there are recognizably superior persons in society, and these people are entitled to more of pretty much everything: more agency, more status, more power. And if that means denying equal rights or equal agency to others, that's absolutely fine, because if we allow recognizable superiors all the agency and power to do what must be done, then everything will be better off potentially for everybody, or at least for everybody that we happen to give a shit about, right? People who are part of our race or our creed or whatever it happens to be. And I think that once you recognize this, there's a lot more space that can open up for dialogue between liberals and socialists, because I would hope that we'd realize that we have a lot more in common with one another than either of our traditions do with the political right, which is not an Enlightenment tradition, is not committed to the values that we happen to hold to, and right now is posing an extraordinary threat to the left and to liberal societies both. So I think it's time to kind of recognize that we've had our differences, but we are under shared threat, and it's important to put those differences aside and recognize that we both have a lot more to gain from learning from one another than we do from continuously confronting one another when the ship is sinking.
No, I think that's exactly right, and that is a good note to end on. That, here on Neon Liberalism, I want to continue to try and engage in these dialogues about what the future of a free and equal society might look like and how we might get there in this time of reactionary, aristocratic, you might even say, assault on those principles. So thanks, Matt, so much for coming on to talk up your book, The Political Theory of Liberal Socialism. Thank you, Paul, for coming on and having this chat with us. Thank you to our listeners for supporting us. As a reminder, Neon Liberalism and Liberal Currents are subscriber-supported publications. So if you like what we do here, go on over to patreon.com/liberalcurrents, or just sign up for our newsletter at liberalcurrents.com. Thanks so much, and I will see you all again next week.